Hello, this is Domenico Composto again with Easynomics, and we are going to continue our discussion of the Keynesian aggregate supply curve. In the previous video, we went over the creation of the Keynesian aggregate supply curve as a result of the Matris model not explaining for the inability of the SRAS curve to shift downward during the Great Depression. So now that we have an understanding of how the Keynesian aggregate supply curve came into being, we're going to divide it into three sections and discuss what's happening in those three sections. All right, so here we're looking at the Keynesian aggregate supply curve. Aggregate supply curve, and we're going to look at its three sections. On the y-axis, we're measuring the price level, or the average price of goods and services in an economy over a particular period of time. And on the x-axis, we're measuring the quantity of output, or in this case, real GDP, since spending equals income, which equals to the value of output being purchased in the economy. So we're going to remember that the Keynesian aggregate supply curve has this shape. There's a horizontal portion that's very flat, and then there's a portion that begins to curve upward. All right, if I can illustrate that. And then there is a vertical portion of the Keynesian aggregate supply curve. Okay, so that's basically the shape. All right, a horizontal portion, then a portion where it begins to curve upward, and then a very vertical portion. And we're going to label that Keynesian aggregate supply. Okay, Keynesian AS. So let's look at these three sections. All right, the first section is right here. All right, this is what we'll call section 1. Okay, in this section, we have the price level falling to a particular point. It will fall to a type, kind of a type of price floor where the price of resources will not fall beyond, let's say, PL1. All right, so right here, resource prices will not fall below this particular point. And this is explained by, as we did in the previous video, labor contracts, minimum wage legislation, worker or union resistance to wage cuts, and even the employer's resistance to cutting wages. All of these factors explain why in a recession, the price level does not fall below a particular point. It hits a type of floor. Now, also in section 1, we have unemployed resources. In this portion, land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship, they are unemployed, and there's a degree of spare capacity within the economy. Next is section 2, which I'll draw from here to here. Okay, maybe in this portion. Right, from this portion to this portion, we'll call that section 2. And here we have the economy beginning to employ their factors of production, beginning to fully employ their factors of production, land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship, and we're getting to the natural rate of unemployment, or the long-run average rate of unemployment in an economy. So resources are beginning to become scarce, and as they become scarce, the price level begins to increase. Price level begins to rise as firms begin to compete for the last remaining available resources. All right, so price level begins to rise. At this point, we're getting to full employment, and this is basically where macroeconomists want the economy to be at. All right. Next is section 3, right here. And in this portion, we've reached what we call the maximum amount of output that the economy can produce. Right? We're at Y max. So So at this point, perhaps aggregate demand is increasing, but we have achieved zero unemployment. All factors of production, land, labor, capital, entrepreneurs are being employed. And from those inputs that are all employed, we can only get Y quantity of output. If we fully employ all of our factory production, all X factors of production, then we can only get Y quantity of outputs. So there's no more that our economy can produce with the available resources. They're all fully employed. And so if aggregate demand continues to increase for this finite quantity of, or this fixed quantity of outputs or finite quantity of outputs, all we get is just a rising price level. The price level beginning to rise. We might experience excessive levels of inflation, perhaps even hyperinflation. So that's essentially the Keynesian aggregate supply curve. Section 1, we have spare capacity, unemployed resources. The price level reaches a floor due to labor contracts, minimum wage legislation, worker and union resistance to wage cuts, employer resistance to wage cuts. In Section 2, we begin to reach full employment. We're employing most of our resources, land, labor, capital. And as a result of the increasing scarcity of these resources, this puts some upward pressure on resource prices. Wages begin to rise, rent begins to rise, interest and profit begins to rise. And as those input prices begin to rise, the output prices begin to rise. And here we have a moderate level of inflation, perhaps 2% inflation, 3% inflation. This is considered tolerable by macroeconomists. And then in the Section 3, we have zero unemployment. We've fully employed all of our land, labor, and capital. And from X quantity of inputs, this can only provide Y quantity of outputs. We can't get any more outputs because all of our resources are employed, and we can only get this quantity. So if aggregate demand continues to increase for a fixed quantity of outputs, all we get is a rising price level. Aggregate demand pushing up the price for those resources and for those outputs, and we end up with excessive levels of inflation and hyperinflation. Okay, so now we can put in aggregate demand and begin mapping out changes in the price level as aggregate demand begins to increase from Section 1 to Section 2 and into Section 3. Okay, so we're just going to get rid of this and begin to plot aggregate demand. And the Y max is not necessary. I'll take that out. I don't really need that for this explanation. Okay. So here we have aggregate demand, and we're going to start off, let's say, in a recessionary gap. Here we are, sorry. Here we have 81. And we're at point A. We have a price level at PL1. And we have real GDP at Y recession 1. So aggregate demand intersects with the Keynesian aggregate supply curve, providing an equilibrium position at point A with an equilibrium price level at PL1 and an equilibrium level of real GDP at Y recession 1. At Y recession 1, we have unemployed resources and unemployed labor being greater than the natural rate of unemployment. And we have spare capacity in the economy. And we don't really have much upward pressure on the price level because there's so much unemployment. Resources like labor are not in a position to bid up their wage. Then, let's say over time, consumption spending begins to increase. Perhaps there's some confidence in the economy and consumers begin to spend more into the economy, and entrepreneurs start to see that revenue is rising and perhaps they're increasing investment spending. And that will cause aggregate demand to increase from 81 to, let's say, 82. From 81 to 82, we reach another equilibrium at point B. with real GDP increasing from Y recession 1 to Y recession 2, but we don't see any increase in the price level because there's still a lot of unemployed resources. Yes, we're beginning to employ more resources, land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship, but there's still a lot of excess resources. So the price level, there's no pressure on the price level to rise. So we're still in the recession. But times are beginning to look better. Consumer spending increases, investment spending continues to increase, and now we're beginning to enter section 2. So aggregate demand is beginning to enter this section. Here's 83. And we have an equilibrium providing an increase in real GDP. So we're at Y, we'll call this Y. We're at full potential GDP. We're at point C, and there's a slight increase in the price level. All right, we're starting to see that the price level is rising. All right, it's going from PL1 to PL2 at this point. Okay, PL2 right over here. So we start to see that slight rise in the price level. So here, unemployed resources are becoming less and less. We're starting to reach full employment. There is still some available land, labor, and capital, but most of the land, labor, and capital is being employed, and firms are beginning to compete with each other to employ the last remaining resources, and that puts pressure on wages. Wages begins to go up, rent goes up, interest might be going up, perhaps profit, and as a result of the input prices going up, input prices begin to rise, and that puts pressure on the output prices begin to rise. So the price level is rising to PL2. Perhaps we're getting a little bit more aggregate demand. Perhaps we're getting to 84. All right, here's 81, 2, and 3. And now we're getting to 84. Perhaps we're still in section 2. All right, we're at point D. All right, I'll call this YP1 and YP2. Here's YP1 and YP2. We're still kind of at full potential GDP. We're in section 2, but we're starting to notice that the price level is beginning to rise due to the increased scarcity of resources. So here's PL3. It's beginning to rise at that point. We're still at full employment. Things look good, but resources are becoming increasingly scarce. All right, so that's section 2. Now we get into section 3. Section 3, aggregate demand continues to increase to 85. And we notice that we don't really get much of an increase in output, but we do get a significant increase in the price level. So prices are beginning to rise to PL4. All resources are fully employed, and increased aggregate demand just leads to an increase in prices with no real change in output. So we're starting to get excessive levels of inflation, and the same thing if 80 was to continue to increase to 86, right? No real increase in output, just an increase in the price level. PL4 to PL5. So hopefully we begin to understand how aggregate demand in the different sections will either impact the price level and output. All right, so section 1, we see with 81 and 82, there's no change in the price level, but we do get an increase in real GDP, or the quantity of output being produced. In section 2, which is points C and D, we're reaching full potential GDP, or full employment. We're getting slight increases in real GDP and slight increases in the price level. So we're getting a moderate level of inflation and moderate levels of increases in real GDP. Section 3, we see that we don't get any change in output. Real GDP does not change, but we do get significant increases in the price level. Now, this is a common kind of paper 1 question where they'll ask, does does a shift in aggregate demand automatically lead to a change in the price level? And you'd be comparing the monetarist model with the Keynesian aggregate supply curve model. In the monetarist model, any shift in AD leads to a change in the price level automatically. But in the Keynesian model, that's not always true. The Keynesian model, we see it depends. If AD is shifting in section 2, no change in the price level. If it's shifting in if it's shifting in section 1, no change in the price level. If it's shifting in section 2, a slight change in the price level. And if it's shifting in section 3, significant change in the price level. And that's it. Thank you so much. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. All the best.